Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're doing something really cool. We're taking a deep dive into the actual architecture of words. Our goal is pretty exciting. We're going to decode exactly how the structural elements in poetry convey these massive, profound cultural and historical themes. You know, it's wild to think about, but before writing even existed, ancient poetry was an oral tradition strictly meant for survival. The rhythms and rhymes, they were literally memory hacks. They were used to pass down life-saving knowledge, laws, and history from generation to generation without losing a single detail. So today, we're not just going to passively read poems. We are going to take them apart, look at the gears and springs inside, and figure out exactly how they tick. So let's kick things off with a deceptively simple question. What is the fundamental difference between a story and a poem? You've probably read plenty of both, right? Well, while stories generally use prose to lay out characters, plots, and a linear sequence of events, poems are an entirely different beast. They uniquely rely on this trinity of elements: sense, sound, and structure. And by combining these three things, a poet can pack an overwhelming amount of meaning into just a few short lines. It's really the purest form of writing, and honestly one of the oldest and most vital forms of human art we have.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, unlocking Afro-Asian poetry. Second, making sense, poetic tropes. Third, feeling it, tone and mood. Fourth, the rhythm, rhyme and meter. And finally, number 5, how structure shapes cultural meaning. Let's jump in.
Part 1. Unlocking Afro-Asian poetry. Which brings us right into Part 2, Making Sense, Poetic Tropes.
All right, let's get into how poets actually construct meaning. When we study poetry, especially from the African and Asian continents, it's honestly like opening a direct, unclouded window into the beliefs, history, and worldviews of those cultures. And to truly understand that worldview, we have to look at the master key of poetic language, the trope. Think of a trope as basically a catch-all term for a figure of speech. It says one thing on the surface, but artfully and imaginatively implies something entirely different right underneath it. Like for an everyday example, if you say it's raining cats and dogs, you obviously aren't warning people about plummeting poodles, right? You're using a trope to describe a heavy downpour instantly and vividly. Poets use tropes so that a single simple line can carry massive emotional and cultural weight, far beyond its literal dictionary definition.
So, let's crack open the toolkit and look at a few of the most dominant tropes, starting with a metaphor. A metaphor is an implied comparison between two fundamentally dissimilar things that happen to share something in common. A classic example you see across world literature is when Romeo compares Juliet to the sun. Now, what's so incredibly powerful about this comparison is that Romeo isn't stating a literal, scientific fact. Juliet is not a giant ball of burning gas. Instead, he uses the trope to imply her incredible radiance, her warmth, and the life-giving fact that his whole world now revolves around her.
Now, closely related to that, and people mix these up all the time, is the simile. Unlike the metaphor, which just implies the comparison as an absolute, a simile is a stated or direct comparison. You can always spot a simile because it relies on key anchor words, almost always like or as. So if Romeo had said Juliet is like the sun, boom, that's a simile. It's a subtle structural difference, but an important one. You might be wondering why use a simile instead of a metaphor. Well, sometimes creating just a tiny bit of distance with the word like paints a more delicate, observant picture, rather than the overwhelming directness of a metaphor. It just gives the poet a totally different kind of brush to paint with.
Next up, we have personification. This is a brilliant figure of speech where an inanimate object, or even an abstract idea, is given human qualities or abilities. Think of the phrase, "the sky is crying." The sky obviously doesn't have tear ducts. It doesn't actually feel sorrow. But by personifying the rain as tears, the poet instantly injects a deep sense of human grief into the natural landscape. And here's the thing. In many African and Asian indigenous cultures, personifying nature isn't just a clever poetic trick. It often reflects a genuine, deeply held worldview where the earth, the weather, and the landscape are living, breathing entities perfectly intertwined with the human experience. And we'll wrap up this rapid-fire definition round with antithesis. This is a figure of speech where parallel words or phrases express opposite or contrasting meanings. Listen closely to the structural balance and the friction in this phrase. When love was murdered, hate was born. You have love contrasting directly with hate, and murdered contrasting directly with born. That parallel structure doesn't just sound cool, it creates this highly dramatic, unforgettable friction in the mind of the listener.
Okay, let's see how this actually works on the page. Let's look at The Tame Bird and the Free Bird by the legendary Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore. Fun fact, He was actually the first Asian to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. In this poem, we get a dialogue between two birds. One is tame, living on a perch in a cage, and the other is free, living out in the woodlands. The free bird cries, "Oh, my love, let us fly to the woods," while the caged bird whispers, "Come here, let us both settle in a cage." Tagore is masterfully using antithesis, the cage versus the open sky, and personification, giving the birds human voices and complex desires to highlight their tragic inability to be together. But to really grasp this, we have to look at the context. Tagore was writing during British colonial rule in India, so the stakes of this poem go way beyond just two birds. The themes of cages, freedom, and the tragic inability to unite, those reflect the very real, agonizing struggles of a colonized people yearning for self-determination.
Which perfectly segues into part 3, feeling it, tone and mood.
So we really need to clear up a classic point of confusion in literary analysis here. What exactly is the difference between tone and mood? Well, tone signifies the author's, or the persona's, attitude toward the subject matter. It's their point of view, conveyed through their specific word choices, rhythm, and punctuation. Mood, on the other hand, is the atmosphere. It's the overall feeling that the piece creates inside you, the reader. To put it simply, tone is how the author speaks, mood is how the author makes you feel.
Let's jump back to Tagore's Birds for a second to see this in action. The tone of the poem is deeply longing and wistful. The persona is intensely focused on the stark, contrasting imagery. The harsh, cold, restrictive iron bars of the cage versus the warm, boundless possibility of the open sky. Through that repeated, desperate pleading between the birds, the author establishes a yearning tone. And because the author uses this tone, it directly shapes the mood for us as the audience. As we read it, we enter an emotional landscape that feels profoundly melancholic, bittersweet, and heartbreaking. The tone dictates the mood. The cold iron creates our sorrow.
Moving on to part 4, the rhythm, rhyme, and meter.
Now, you might already be intuitively familiar with rhyme, the pleasing repetition of syllables sharing similar sounds at the end of a line. But let's focus on something even more foundational, meter. Meter is the basic rhythmic structure of a poetic line. It is mathematically made up of the number of syllables in a line and the specific pattern of emphasis or stress on those syllables. Honestly, if you've ever nodded your head to a hip-hop beat or tapped your foot to a catchy pop song, you already intuitively understand meter. It's the pulse. And in poetry, we measure this meter in individual rhythmic units called feet.
This is where it gets really fun, and I actually want you to say these out loud with me wherever you are right now. Let's look at the different types of metrical feet. The iamb is an unaccented syllable followed by an accented one. Think the word defend. Say it out loud, defend. You hear that rising beat? A trochee is the exact opposite, an accented syllable followed by an unaccented one, giving a falling beat. Mercy, mercy. Then we have a dactyl, which is one accented followed by two unaccented. Camouflage, camouflage. And finally, the anapest, two unaccented, followed by one accented. Supersede, supersede. This underlying phonetic data isn't just trivia. It is literally the invisible drum driving the emotion and pace of the entire poem.
So what does this meter look like in practice? Let's take the classic poem Down from the Mountain by the great Chinese poet Li Po. If we analyze the line, "As down Mount Emerald at eve I came," we can actually count 5 iambic feet. Listen to the natural pauses as I read it. As down Mount Emerald at eve I came. That's 5 feet, which means it's pentameter, iambic pentameter. Why does this matter? Because that specific unaccented accented marching rhythm deliberately mimics the steady, plodding walking rhythm of someone hiking down a steep mountain path. The poet is using the sound to replicate the physical action. The structure actually becomes the experience.
Which brings us to our final section, part 5, structure shapes cultural meaning.
Let's pull all these threads together. Consider the incredibly powerful poem Africa, My Africa by David Diop. Diop was heavily associated with the Negritude literary movement, which fiercely centered pride in African identity, heritage, and culture. In his poem, he addresses Africa directly through personification. Notice the striking antithesis he builds here. The sweat and blood of slavery contrasted against a young tree springing up patiently and obstinately. Through his deliberate, defiant tone, he evokes a horrific history of hardship and humiliation under colonization. But at the very same time, that tone shapes a mood of undeniable, enduring strength, leaving the reader with the bitter but beautiful taste of ultimate eventual liberation. The antithesis, the tone, and the mood all work in perfect harmony. The structural elements are literally holding the weight of an entire continent's history.
So, to summarize our master toolkit today, trope, tone, mood, rhyme, meter. I want you to remember that these aren't just dry, boring textbook terms you memorize for a test. They work together. They're an integrated system. Understanding how they interact allows you to fully analyze, deconstruct, and most importantly, deeply feel the cultural and emotional impact of any poem you encounter.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this provocative thought. Afro-Asian poetry is a mirror reflecting the vibrant, often turbulent, and endlessly resilient histories of its people. The next time you read a poem, I challenge you, don't just read the words, look closely at the architecture. Ask yourself, based on the tropes being used, the tone of the speaker, and the literal heartbeat of the meter, what real-world values, struggles, or profound experiences was this poet preserving for their community? Use your new toolkit, decode the structure, and unlock the history for yourself. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.